speaking on this implementation of this budget bill. I think what's become very clear, Mr. Speaker, over the last number of years with this Conservative government is a pattern, and a very disturbing pattern, a pattern on one hand of reckless spending, a pattern of reckless attacks on the credibility and the institutions of public office in this country, and a sense of entitlement that we see again and again and again, that it's who you know in the PMO. It's if you're one of their buddies, things happen. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at the largest debt in Canadian history, and some of that debt, Mr. Speaker, we would all agree in this House was necessary in order to stimulate a very broken world economy. But when we look back on what we end up with having spent this $50 billion, Mr. Speaker, I think future generations will think, my God, what was that Conservative government thinking? For example, that they blew money right across this country on personal pet projects, like, for instance, in the industry minister's riding, where they paid stimulus dollars to heat the seats in the hockey arena so that the derrieres of Conservative voters wouldn't be discomforted while they were watching amateur hockey. Meanwhile, there's no plan for national broadband across this country. You know, Mr. Speaker, in Australia, under the Labour government, they made a commitment to hook up 93% of Australia by massive broadband implementation, while in my riding, they're still talking about dial-up as being a standard for duty to serve. We could have had a massive infrastructure program to retrofit energy in homes across this country so that people could live better. But instead, we see again personal pet projects like draining a lake in Muskoka and building a fake lake in Toronto, blowing through $1 billion on a weekend, blowing $17 billion on stealth fighter jets to fight a Cold War that's long since passed. $17 billion, Mr. Speaker. It's astounding. Single source contract, no justification. $10 billion for prisons at a time when crime rates are dropping. Mr. Speaker, the latest amount that they're spending $155 million on 570 jail cells. That amounts to $270,000 per jail cell. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, in my community of Attawapiskat, in my community of Kashechewan, we have no grade schools and a government who says the pocket's bare. Children in Oxford House First Nation who can't go to school because their school has been poisoned with mold. And we have a government that says the cupboard's bare for them. But again, Mr. Speaker, if you know someone in the PMO, if you're one of their buddies, there's always money that can be found. And Mr. Speaker, I think we need to look at a few glaring examples, because I think this government is sending the signal that if you're one of them, come put the touch on us and we'll look after you. Nowhere is this more glaring, Mr. Speaker, than the fact that, as I raised in the House earlier this week, there's a NAFTA challenge by an American named Vito Gallo, who's demanding $355 million from the Canadian taxpayer for the failed Adams Mine project. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have a number of NAFTA challenges at different times between investors in foreign countries, and as much as we've raised problems with Chapter 11 NAFTA, we've never seen anything as outrageous and bizarre as this. 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker, Waste Management Incorporated walked away on the Adams Mine project because of the issue of liability. In the same way that the second largest waste management company in North America, BFI, Browning Ferris Incorporated, walked away just a few years ago previous to that because of the issue of liability. The deal died, Mr. Speaker. And the City of Toronto made it clear that they would never, ever, ever entertain this garbage project again because it was so reckless. It was so unfounded. It was also, Mr. Speaker, subject to a federal EA, so that if anyone even wanted to try and take on this bizarre scheme, they were going to have to face a federal environmental assessment because it had been identified of the threat of groundwater contamination on First Nation territory of the Timmins-James First Nation. Now, Mr. Speaker, long after this deal went south, a group of conservative businessmen set up a numbered company in Toronto, and they secretly bought the site, and They didn't do anything with this site, Mr. Speaker. They didn't put any money on it. They didn't bid in on any contracts. It was just this numbered company. Now, the interesting thing is this Mr. Vito Gallo claims to be the sole owner of this site. He says he's owed $355 million from the Canadian taxpayer. Yet, Mr. Speaker, when we look at who invested in this site, we see connections to this present Conservative Party that's quite staggering. For example, the Globe and Mail, May 8, 2003, identifies the owners of this numbered company, 1532-382 Ontario Inc., as being the Cortellucci-Montemarano Group. And the Globe and Mail says a major contributor to the Conservative Party has quietly bought the Adams Mine in Northern Ontario. And the contributor, the Cortellucci-Montemarano Group, is attempting to buy 2,000 acres of Crown land beside the site. We see Toronto Star, May 9th. They talk about 2003, that Mario Cortellucci admits he's one of dozens investors. One of dozens investors, not that Vito Gallo, who nobody had ever heard of then, as a sole owner. He claims to be one of dozens investors. Now, this article on the Toronto Star 2003 is very fascinating because it starts off with this line, Mr. Speaker. Walking into the Hollywood Princess restaurant off a string of strip malls along Highway 7 in Concord is like stepping into another world. The massive banquet center is all about glamour, complete with fountains, mirrors, and white columns that have served as backdrops to countless wedding receptions and, perhaps more significantly, dozens of high-priced Tory fundraisers. This is the world of Mario Cortellucci. That's a direct quote from the Toronto Star. Well, Mr. Speaker, that address of the Hollywood Princess restaurant just so happens to be the same address that a check was written to the Ontario government in order to attempt to buy 2,000 acres of Crown land secretly from this numbered company. It's the same address, 2800 Highway 7, Concord, Ontario, the Hollywood Princess restaurant. So we see direct money from Canadian businessmen in this numbered company. We don't see any American. We don't see any mention of Mr. Vito Gallo. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you're wondering why a guy like Vito Gallo would be so brazen to think he could come and hit up the Canadian taxpayers for $355 million for a project that he never put a dime into the site. He's never bid on any contracts. We'd think this is a very spurious claim, but Mr. Speaker, we look at the connections, the financial connections between these backers and this government. It's quite astounding. For example, Mr. Mario Cortellucci gave $5,000 to the Federal Conservatives in 2004, $5,000 to the Federal Conservatives in 2006. Janessa, Nicola, Rosanna Cortellucci gave $5,000 each to the Conservative Party in 2004. Three others, Fabrizio, Nicholas, and Sabrina Cortellucci, gave $2,500 each to the Conservative Party in 2004. Then they gave the maximum of $5,000 each to the Conservative Party in 2006. Five other Cortelluccis gave $17,500 to the Conservatives in January 2004. Now, through their numbered companies, Mr. Speaker, this is where it gets interesting. Four Valleys Excavating and Grading, which is tied to Nina Cortellucci, $12,170 to the leadership bid of the present finance minister, $5,000 to his leadership bid, again, the present industry minister, $10,000 for the leadership bid of the present industry minister. Mr. Speaker, Arium Development Corporation, which lists Mario Cortellucci as a director, $10,000 to the present industry minister. 1532382 Ontario Inc., the very company that's going after the taxpayer claiming to be an American company, gave $4,000 to the present industry minister directly in his leadership bid. So, Mr. Speaker, we've got a number of other companies, but I won't go through more and more details. Now,